how do we support and manage our threats? And by now, these are probably questions that you've started to understand once we start talking about our threat actors and the different types of techniques and tactics and procedures. And we've identified certain threat actor groups, and we know what script kiddies are, and we know what organized crime looks like. Well, isn't there a way that we can help us manage these types of threats, right? Is there a framework that we can follow? And absolutely there are. There are multiple frameworks that we can follow. And in this video, as an overview, we're going to talk about those different threat management frameworks and what they are. So the very first one is our MITRE framework. Now, as you're already familiar, the MITRE framework is a widely used framework for our information security community. It's been around for many years. Basically, it's got a couple of things, right? It's free, so we can go in there, we can look at the different TTPs, different threat groups, and then what applies to our specific industry. And think of this as our core threat management framework, right? We can go in there, and in a later video, we're going to get a little bit more practical. We'll jump into the actual MITRE framework, and then we'll utilize some of the on-screen functions to start working out and run through a bit of a hands-on demo. But in this video, let's just talk a little bit about it. And then in subsequent video, we'll do a bit of a hands-on component. So this is going to make up the core of our threat management framework. It outlines the techniques, tactics, and procedures across the threat actors, identifying them by names, identifying them by numbers that you've seen. And the MITRE basically shows how to put in controls, right? There's a controls component which shows us how to do or introduce mitigations, how to slow things down if we're doing phishing. It's probably not going to show you a full specific full hand-in-hand process on how to mitigate it on a certain appliance of some sort, but it is going to show you a holistic overview approach on how to mitigate, put in certain controls to slow down and mitigate the certain threat. So the MITRE framework is one of the key areas that we're going to look at. It's widely used across different information security communities. Now, the other one here as well that I want to touch on is the MITRE framework for industrial control systems. So I'm just going to put in MITRE or ICS. And this has been around for many years as well, and MITRE have gone away, and they've created an industrial control systems specific MITRE threat management framework as well. So for those organizations that operate specifically in industrial controls, these are things like water. I've just had a message come through. Water supplies, we've got electrical, maybe there's pumps and diesels and, those kinds of things that operate quite a whole holistic types of controls, right? If they're used for mass consumption like gas and fuels like, diesel and petrol and things like that, these are often things that operating in a single control, or a controller of some sort, and they're kind of highly sensitive data. They're highly segmented out. So there's obviously, just due to the sensitivity behind the actual controllers themselves and the data that they house, the ICSs are usually provisioned on highly segmented and controlled networks. So this is something else just to be aware of. There's the MITRE for the ICS component as well. So should a business be running industrial controls, typically those controllers have been built without, sometimes without security in mind. Now, obviously, to this date in 2023, things have gone a little bit better. But, if you're operating in the ICS, there's obviously a set of controls and, threat actors that are obviously targeting, mass produce like functions as well. So that's one area. Now, the other one here that we've got is the Lockheed and Martin. Now, I've got a separate tab open that we're going to jump into in just a moment. So the Lockheed and Martin has been around for several years now, and this is the kill chain. So I'm just going to put KC here for kill chain for short. And this sort of defines the different stages of the attack, and the different stages are recon. We have weaponization. I'm just going to do weapon for short. And then we've got our delivery, and then we have our exploit, and then we have our installation, and then we've got our C2 channels that get spun up there. And then finally, we have our objections. And we'll cover these in just a moment. And basically what the kill chain does is, well, what's the end-to-end approach And this is a very comprehensive and down and dirty around, well, each phase of an attack kind of happens like this. Well, firstly, there's recon that takes place through passive or maybe aggressive scanning that happens, or passive and active scanning that kind of happens, or maybe there's a level of OSINT that happens. We're identifying the potential victim in this sort of scenario. What systems are they using? What industry they're in? Are there any sort of potential vulnerabilities that we can define and outline? What do they look like? Servers, systems, host names. What does that look like? And then from there, we take it and we sort of weaponize that data. We collect it. We collect the data, we sift through it, and we prioritize it, right? How do we use that information now to prepare the attack or prepare to deliver the attack? And that's our next phase of the attack process there. So that's the delivery component. How are we going to deliver the attack? Is that going to be through a share profile? Are we going to deliver it through creating an admin account and then installing something? Are we going to install it or deliver it through a phishing platform or a phishing campaign platform? How do we define what that delivery process looks like? And then from there, it'll be obviously an exploit of some sort. So if the payload is running in a certain language, do we have to craft something in ASPX, for example? And then do we have to create an ASPX payload that we have to upload to a server and then download it? What does that look like? So that exploit sort of defines that component. From there, we move over into the installation component. Should that ASPX payload install? How does that installation happen? Right through the payload, there's a malware, there's a backdoor of some sort. And then from there, we go into our C2 channel, so how we control and operate that remote connection. And then finally, we've got the objections. So in the previous video, we sort of saw the AFP scenario where someone was arrested for, 90 grand worth of fraud. The end goal in and I don't want to maybe speak on behalf of that person or anything like that, but in that specific objection, if we look at that as the goal or the intent, well, was the intent to fraudulently cause $90,000 worth of malicious activity? Maybe and potentially yes. Is the malicious activity linked to cause denial of service or distributed denial of service on an organization? And if so, how does that look? If it is, causing, or manipulating or stealing data. So if we steal data, if that's the main cause, well, then this is the flow that we're going to operate in. And if we can then sort of define what that flow looks like from either the threat actors, but within our own internal organization, we then take that capability, and then if we know that, to do certain recon or to do certain weaponization or to the point of exploit, if we're talking with the point of exploit, that we've got all our servers are on the current versions of operating systems, there's no outdated functions, there's no outdated software vulnerabilities, and that's just at a high level. There's multiple other areas that we're going to look at, but if all those servers are all patched and it's all hunky-dory, and at that point of basically doing our vulnerability management or whatever thing that we're doing, we want to be able to go into this sort of kill chain and then create that tough link, or we want to remove that link altogether. Now, this is all about slowing down that scenario or removing it altogether. If something does not apply in this sort of scenario, that's the better part for the organization, right? So if we can then reduce the level of recon that we can take place, so if only they can go to our website, our publicly available website, and it doesn't have usernames up there, it doesn't have email addresses, there's no list of information to spearfish people. And if they go over to LinkedIn, perhaps, maybe that is the only source of risk for us, because if they do go over to LinkedIn, then they can see the roles, they can see the names of the people, and it doesn't take long to then maybe jump over to hunter.io and then start looking at maybe potential email addresses. So as long as we know how that recon process kind of looks, we can start putting in relevant controls even at that very first layer. So before anything kind of happens at exploit or installing, or God forbid, the C2 and command and control. So we then take that bit of recon, we can build out a list of potential recon initial steps or processes that someone can go through, and then we can define what they are. And then ultimately it sort of comes down to, well, why is this important? Why do this? I guess why use it? Why is it important to us? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Well, the first part is end to end, right? And if we know how this looks end to end, well, then we can put in certain controls at each of those levels or each of those phases of the kill chain, and then we can slow down and, create certain controls and certain measures at each of those phases. The other part of that is think of this as scenarios, right? We can create custom, or as any organization, when you start creating custom attack simulations, you create scenarios. So you can do a scenario build with this as an objection, I should say, and then you can start defining how we implement controls. What are some of the attack tools that we can then take into account? So this is sort of the Lockheed Martin's been around for a little while now. It's been a great sort of source into understanding these sort of attacks. And then in just a moment as well, I'm going to go over to that web page as well so we can start looking at it. So over here is the Lockheed Martin. You can just go over and Google Lockheed Martin kill chain, and you can come to this page. And they've done a great job at sort of summarizing some information here. You can go through and read it. But what I want to sort of touch on are the actual points that we kind of mentioned as well before. So these, step one, our recon, right? What does this look like? So, how do we obtain email addresses, social media networks, discovering internet facing servers, things like that. And then some sort of defending controls as well. How do we then mitigate those types of risks? So then we've got our recon, our weaponization. How do we take that data that we've found? How do we organize it and then use it for, if we're going to abuse those sort of services? Then delivering. So how do we deliver the actual the attack itself, right? So how do we begin to process, again, through an email? Is it going to be a USB delivery? Is it going to be a social media interaction? Is it going to be a physical, are we going to go on site anywhere and actually physically engage with people and then give them a USB or do something else malicious? So, the delivery is focused on how do we intend to actually deliver that phase of the attack. Exploitation, again, could be through, a physical access kind of thing. So if we're physically exploiting, a server or a switch or a router or, a person of some sort, how are we going to exploit or gain access to that potential victim? Then installation, as we mentioned before, so the installation component is how we intend to install the payload, the malware. How does that get installed, right? Is it going to run some sort of process job? Is it going to run? It's going to go into the registry, create something in registry. Is it going to launch PowerShell and do something in PowerShell? How does that look? And then we've got our command and control, so how we intend to communicate with the remote host. And then finally, our objections. So how do the objections stack up to, to the actual, mission's goal? So that's a Lockheed Martin. The other one here that I want to talk about is this is the Carbonac APT, and this is, I think, almost 10 years ago, February 2015, which has been a little while ago. And this is sort of an attack that saw a lot of the financial institutions around the world almost 10 years ago go a little bit haywire when this sort of attack came through. So I'm not going to go through the actual threat that's been released. This was through Kaspersky. They've done a bit of a threat analysis based on the risk, based on this APT and the APT group that was responsible for this kind of activity. What you want to sort of go through and what I want to share with you is our next framework, which is our diamond model intrusion analysis, and I'll cover that in just a moment. But what I want to cover here is just to be aware of the different sort of APTs that have existed, right? And if it's specific malware, we kind of know what and how they're going to start delivering this, right? So I'm just taking my mouse and cursor here. So the executive summary covers, what the attack did. So this goes back to a couple of things that we mentioned before. Do you remember our strategic and operational and our tactical? This overview just kind of defines what that is, right? It's, here we go. So in 23 onwards, cyber criminals or the attack similar operating in, operandi was used according to victims and law enforcement agencies. So this was, particularly around the financial and banks and, the financial industries were sort of heavily affected by this, by this malware. Further down sort of goes into the details of, how we did it. So what we can sort of learn from this is, and what I want to get to was the actual IOCs, because when we use the diamond model approach, we can take certain indicators of compromise and then we can start building out, certain key areas, and I'll cover that in just a moment. So again, I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but you can see there's analysis here of, how they analyze the malware, to some of the functions. So you can see there was a spear phishing attempt that happens. I'll just grab my cursor here, and the email looks something like that. And then they've got a raw file attachment to that. And then, appendix 1, you can see there's a spear phishing thing that's also been attached for our reference. And then from there, once the victim runs and launches the raw file, then we've got some sort of malicious activity occurring. So now we look at the malware analysis. So it's a backdoor. It operates and runs, in the system32 component. Obviously runs alongside the service host.exe. And then from there, it does some funky stuff, right? It renames its services, does some stuff here with, this service at the time, 2003 Windows XP, yada, yada, yada. You can go through this in your own time as we just sort of understand it. But the part that I want to get to is just around the corner here. Are the sort of the ISEs, and there's a whole appendix page on the other side, at the bottom of this document. You can just Google this as well. You can go to Krebs on security and look at the Carbonac APT engagement, and then there's a report here by Kaspersky. And where I want to get to with this is basically as we go into our threat management sort of frameworks and processes, and I do want to just move over just to the right about here. Just clear this. Okay. And what I want to mention is our diamond intrusion analysis model. So I'm just going to call this our diamond intrusion analysis model. I'll call this DIAM for sure. And the DIAM basically allows us to do a couple of things as we're sort of investigating threats and as we're building out our threat management framework. The first part is the victim. So if we look at this as the Carbonac APT, it's a piece of malware, well, what are its capabilities? And from there, we can sort of define, potential IOCs, and we'll just switch back and forth in just a moment as I write this out. And then we've got infrastructure here to the right. And then to the bottom, I'm just going to write adversary, because then we can just tie these to specific adversaries and then how this looks. So we basically start off with a victim and we say, okay, well, if the victim gets installed with a backdoor, then that's great. Fantastic, cool. Backdoor gets installed. Well, what are the potential IOCs, right? And what do they look like, right? So are there certain IP address ranges, certain hash files? And then from there, we kind of work this way. So we go look at the capabilities. Well, what are those capabilities associated? Are there certain, are they using SSH for anything? Are they using their own toolkits for anything else? We can start then profiling certain capabilities based on that specific backdoor. Then from there, we jut across to our infrastructure, and then we can say, okay, well, holistically across our infrastructure, where can this happen again? And if it is going to happen, well, how do we then build controls around that? But then how are we also aware of the infrastructure that it can cause impacts on? Because chances are, if it's installed as a backdoor on our system somewhere, and we're running that same system across, a range of other hosts or other different services that are relying on that service, well, then chances are we'll need to look at our infrastructure and then understand where else that could happen. And then from there, we tie it down to either an adversary if we're not sure, or we can start then threat profiling that based on identifying who likes to use it. Now, if this is a known industry or a known adversary, that's great. We can look that up and research that more. If not, then we can start profiling certain characteristics and capabilities that we've mentioned to then put in prevention and other sort of controls. So I'm just going to zoom back to the actual document here, and then I'm just going to get my pen to come up, and then we're going to just quickly annotate a couple of things here. So you can see there's a couple of IOCs here, right? So there's a couple of, download functions, and then AMI run. So AMI is they noticed that AMI was an admin remote control function that was already previously loaded onto this machine. So what they would tend to do is they'll reload AMI, and then AMI would be added to the firewall's exclusion list, so then they can remote control the machine. So then we've got more information here around hashes and file names and stuff like that. So once we know what these look like, we can then start creating certain controls and start updating our threat toolkits as well to support our infrastructure. So having said that, when we're using the actual DIAM model, we can go away, we can look at these IOCs and then start profiling, our environment. So that's the Lockheed and Martin. We've covered the MITRE framework. This is the Carbonac APT that's been around for the, well, you still haven't seen it actively in the market for the last few years, but this caused a lot of havoc almost 10 years ago, and you can go online, read about it. It talks about how they intend to do lateral movements, and that's the admin account that was running across the infrastructure. So there's the hash file as well. You can take that as a guidance step as well. So should your machines be running a certain admin function, there's maybe a certain hash that's associated with that application. So you can take that. And in the previous video, I showed you how to do the MD5 hash file conversion as well. So we can take that, put that into our systems as well. And you can just read on and understand more around how these APTs kind of work. And then the last page, as we go down to the appendix, we've got decoders and encryptors over here that sort of shows you the C2 interaction, and then a bat file to detect the infection. And then here is our IOCs. So for this type of attack, there are multiple pages of IOCs that we can add. There's IP addresses, there's types and hashes that we can sort of account for. And this kind of gives you a bit of a breakdown on what to expect, right? If there's a hash associated with a specific account or a function that we're using, then we need to make note of that and understand what the potential continuous types of attacks that are vulnerable to us as well. So I'm just going to remove my pen and I'm going to go back to the other page. And that sort of covers this video from our introduction to threat management. We've covered the MITRE framework across the traditional MITRE framework. We've also looked at the industrial control systems. We've also looked at Lockheed and Martin. And then finally, we've looked at the last piece here, which was our diamond model intrusion analysis, which takes the victim, the capabilities, we look at our infrastructure, and finally we tie it to an APT. I hope you found this video useful, and in the next video, we're going to jump into do a bit more of a demo across the MITRE framework. Thank you for viewing, and I'll see you in the next video.